Good day. In this video, made on the weekend, I'm going to discuss firstly the battlefield situation in Ukraine, some reports about an interview that Putin has given to the Russia 24 television station, and thirdly, I'm also going to discuss again some international relations developments, looking specifically once more at India's stance. Anyway, let's first of all deal with the military situation in Ukraine. And over the last 24 hours, there's been a cascade of news coming from the Bakhmut battlefield. Now, yesterday evening, there were reports of a very severe, very powerful intensification of Russian attacks within Bakhmut itself and in the area of the village of Ivanivska. This is one of those villages, the Russians call it Krasnoye. It sits astride one of the two roads that go into Bakhmut from the west, which the Ukrainians have used to resupply their forces in Bakhmut. And I should say that both of these roads, for some time now, have been covered by Russian artillery. They're not really usable by Ukrainian vehicles, or at least not to the extent that probably Ukraine would need to keep its garrison fully supplied. But the Russians have not so far succeeded in capturing these two villages, Ivanivska in the south and Khromovo a little further north, which sit astride these two roads and which would enable them conclusively to block the roads. And there is also, of course, a corridor, if you like, involving country roads and open fields between Khromovo and Ivanivska, which can still, up to a certain point, be used by Ukraine to move troops and supplies into and out of Bakhmut, though this area also is covered by Russian artillery. And I've discussed in the past the difficulties of using the road areas, of using these open fields and these dirt roads to send equipment and supplies and troops, fresh troops, into Bakhmut. Though it's clear that Ukraine is continuing to try to do that. Anyway, as I said, yesterday, reports of intense attacks on Ivanivska by the Wagner forces. Not very much information about what's happened other than there's intense fighting there. And perhaps it's worthwhile recalling that an earlier Russian report claimed that there were as many as 3 brigades of Ukrainian troops garrisoning, holding out in Ivanivska. So this is a significant force. If those brigades were up to strength, we would be talking about something like 12,000 men there, but it's probably only a fraction of that, since unlikely that these brigades are up to strength, but nonetheless a significant force trying to hold on to Ivanivska, and as I said, very intense fighting going on there. But there's also apparently been very intense fighting in Bakhmut itself, and again, as of last night, it was not clear exactly where all this fighting was going on, but again, it did seem clear that the Russians were making some progress, and that this intensification of the fighting with very heavy artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut was starting to exact a significant toll. Now, this morning we got an important update, and it's now coming from a variety of sources, from Yuri Podolyaka, a commentator on the Russian side. I believe he's actually of Ukrainian origin, but anyway, regardless, he's one of the key reporters of events in the battlefields. He's obviously got substantial sources, and he's given information that Russian forces in Bakhmut, specifically the Wagner organization, have now captured the entirety of the giant AZOM plant, which is located in the north of Bakhmut and which was, from what I can tell, the biggest factory in Bakhmut by far. And simultaneously, roughly simultaneously, with this information from Podolyaka, RIA Novosti, which is a news agency also owned by the Russian government, has come out and said the same thing. And there's been videos and pictures which do appear to show Wagner troops in control of the territory of the AZOM plant. Of course, they don't show the entire AZOM plant. One can't really claim that, but anyway, they do seem to show Russian troops in control of the AZOM plant at Wagner organization troops. And I have to say, they look pretty relaxed. It doesn't seem like they are afraid of an immediate attack. And there's also pictures of the plant itself, plant buildings, some of which look pretty devastated, at least to me. So it does now look as if the AZOM plant has fallen under Russian control. And this appears to have been the biggest fortified position that Ukraine had within Bakhmut. And I think its loss will have weakened significantly Ukrainian defenses inside Bakhmut. From what I can tell, and again, let me emphasize, I'm neither on the ground, I have no information about what's going on the ground in Bakhmut other than what appears in open sources, and I'm absolutely not an expert in tactics, military strategy, or how to fortify positions. But from what I've been able to understand, there are basically two major fortified positions that the Ukrainian military had in Bakhmut. One was the AZOM plant and the attendant industrial area, these big industrial buildings which form natural fortresses and which, in the case of the AZOM plant, certainly had various subterranean passages and buildings and, well, structures beneath the plant. All of that now appears to have been captured. And another is a stadium, the Avant-Garde Stadium, that still appears to be under Ukrainian control, though the Russians are pressing hard on it. My guess, and it is purely a guess, is that once the Russians capture the Avant-Garde Stadium, if of course they do, more about that in a moment, then the Battle of Bakhmut will, to all intents and purposes, be over. It will be a case more of mopping up operations than of a real contest over who controls the town. Now, I say that, and this is where the next point I'm going to make. We are still left with these tantalizing rumors about a Ukrainian counterattack to try to relieve the pressure on Bakhmut. And I've been seeing again various maps which show the extraordinary concentration of Ukrainian brigades in and around Bakhmut. Now, this has been, I should say, true. I've been seeing maps like this which show dozens of Ukrainian brigade level units around Bakhmut since December. So this is not in itself an entirely new thing. So there's been this enormous concentration of forces. And Slavyangrad has very helpfully juxtaposed these maps showing the number of Ukrainian troops, or rather Ukrainian military formations near Bakhmut, with the much lower number of Ukrainian military formations around Avdiivka, where another major battle is going on, and around Marinka, which is another site of another battle. Now, when people talk about how long this battle has gone on for, it's important to bear this in mind. I mean, the reason why this battle has been fought for so long is because Ukraine has concentrated so much of its combat force trying to defend Bakhmut, trying to hold on to this town regardless of cost. And there is another report today in the London Times, Sunday Times, the Sunday edition of the London Times, because that's essentially what it is, which again claims that Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut are in 3 figures a day. It's not clear whether these are killed and wounded. My suspicion is that it is killed rather than killed and wounded. But anyway, Ukraine is paying an enormously high price for holding on to Bakhmut. We know that the US military are skeptical of the high price paid, whether this is worthwhile. So is Germany's intelligence agency, the BND. So am I. I've expressed my doubts about this for weeks, months even. And nonetheless, it seems that Ukraine is continuing to pay this price to try to hold on to Bakhmut for as long as possible. And as we've seen, there have been even reports, even suggestions that they might be contemplating some kind of a counterattack in this area to try and regain control of Bakhmut, push the Russians back from Bakhmut, perhaps even trap the Wagner forces there. Now, on that, I have to say that again, as of this morning, there's been no information about a Ukrainian counterattack. We'll see whether it comes. In the past, I've assumed that such a counterattack would happen, given the importance Ukraine has attached to Bakhmut. I still am skeptical. I can't understand why Ukraine would not launch such a counterattack if they're prepared to pay the price for such an obviously important to them town. But we'll just have to wait and see what they do. Now, one thing I must say, and it has been a consistent fact about this conflict ever since it began, is that we have pretty precise information from all of these various maps, both Russian maps, Ukrainian maps, to some extent Western maps, of Ukrainian military dispositions. We never have anything like the same information, the same detailed information about Russian military dispositions. So I don't know how many Russian troops there are in and around Bakhmut. I don't even know the exact number of the Wagner forces that are operating in Bakhmut. I've guesstimated that they're probably somewhere in the region of 25,000. That's not just a guess, pure guess. It's based to some extent on information, publicly available information, but it's not a figure I can remotely confirm. I've guesstimated that there's around 30,000 Ukrainian troops inside Bakhmut and in the immediate area. That's, again, my own guess. It might be an underestimate if the claims that are now coming both from Russian and US sources are true, which is that there's between 15 and 20,000 Ukrainian troops inside Bakhmut itself. And I would go back to that report in the article by Larry Johnson in his exceptional website, Sonar 21, that I discussed yesterday. He was provided information by an informed American source that there's 15 to 20,000 Ukrainian troops essentially surrounded inside Bakhmut, which would suggest to me that the number of Ukrainian troops outside Bakhmut must be rather larger than I thought, but there we go. But again, let me stress once more, these are all estimates. I simply don't know the precise numbers. And I don't know how strong the Russian forces around Bakhmut are, but they do seem to have a very substantial advantage in artillery. And I would have thought, and Larry Johnson has discussed also some of the logistical issues, that this would make a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut, or in the area of Bakhmut, problematic. And Larry Johnson's source again said that it will be difficult to sustain, presumably for these same logistical reasons, that the Ukrainians might only be able to sustain a counterattack in Bakhmut for 4 to 5 or 6 days, which might not be enough to achieve a decisive result in this battle. Anyway, about 10 days ago, I thought that the week that passed would be Ukraine's last remaining window for this counterattack. I'm going to revise that. I think there's still time for Ukraine to do it. The Russians have not consolidated control of Bakhmut, and they've not closed the ring fully around Bakhmut. The number of Ukrainian troops fighting in Bakhmut has clearly slowed the Russian operation. In fact, it's been heavy pushing ever since the Battle of Bakhmut began. But that window is not going to remain indefinitely open, given the direction of the fighting. Ukraine will have to make a decision fairly soon whether it's prepared to risk a counterattack in this area or what else it's going to do. Now, I'm going to just make 2 further observations. We have been reading reports about the fighting in Bakhmut going on for 9 months, and that is true if you take the entire duration of the fighting in and around Bakhmut. And it's a point many people have made that I should say that's not unique in war. As I said, if you go back to the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the French war in Vietnam, the one which ended in defeat for France, well, the encirclement of Dien Bien Phu and the battle there also took months, I think something like the same period of time that the fighting in Bakhmut has been taking place before the North Vietnamese finally forced the French forces in Dien Bien Phu to surrender. So this is not such an extended battle, given that we're talking about a siege, and especially given the importance that the Ukrainians have attached to trying to hold on to this town. But there's something else. There's another point, I think, which perhaps is worth pointing out, which is that Russian pressure on Bakhmut has not been at the same consistent level over the entire 9-month period. The Russians made significant advances in the area of Bakhmut in July and early August, as I remember. They captured an important thermal power station near Bakhmut. I think that was towards the end of July. And they started to get close to Bakhmut, and they started to encroach some of the villages around some of the villages to the south of Bakhmut in early August. But then in late August, September, October, early November, the main story in Ukraine, at least so far as the media was concerned, was not Bakhmut. It was the Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kharkiv and in Kherson region. And though fighting in and around Bakhmut never ceased, it's clear that the Russian forces, which were significantly smaller in scale then than they are now, the Russian forces at least had their hands full dealing with these 2 Ukrainian counteroffensives, and it's clear that Bakhmut, the fight for Bakhmut, was given less priority. So the present period, if you like, of intensification of the battle really began in late November through December. And of course, it was in January that Solidar was captured. And it's since January that the Russians have made the biggest progress around Bakhmut. So just to say that this is a battle where the Russian pushes ebbed and flowed, and which has not always perhaps been the center of attention. But there's something else to say, which is that there's obviously different numbers for the number of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. It could be, well, I've seen at one point the minimum number was 3,000. I think it's now acknowledged that it's significantly more than that. Let's say a minimum number of 10,000 Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. And the maximum number is 20,000. If Bakhmut is captured and most of those troops are defeated in some way, either captured or killed, coming on top of the very heavy losses Ukraine has suffered trying to defend Bakhmut, especially since the renewed Russian offensive on Bakhmut began in late November, then this is going to be a very heavy defeat for Ukraine indeed. And I think that is something people need to understand and acknowledge. Though, as I said, that defeat has not yet happened. One reason why Ukraine might be tempted to launch a counterattack is to avert such a defeat. So this is a high-stakes battle for Ukraine. If they sit back and do nothing, if they lose Bakhmut after all of those losses they've already incurred trying to defend Bakhmut, it is a big defeat. If they lose all those thousands of men in Bakhmut, if they're not able to evacuate them and the town is still captured, it's an even bigger defeat. In fact, it would be an enormous defeat. And of course, if they launch a counterattack to try to relieve the pressure on Bakhmut and are defeated, then frankly, we're not talking about a defeat. We're talking about a catastrophe. So I think we need to understand the context of this. The Ukrainians are able to hold on to Bakhmut. If they're able to launch a successful counterattack there, then I agree with Larry Johnson. It'd be deeply embarrassing for the Russians. It will provoke many recriminations, but it will not end the war, and it will not be decisive. Ukraine has staked very much on Bakhmut. It sacrificed large numbers of its troops on Bakhmut, defending Bakhmut. If it loses now, then in light of the losses it's already suffered and the losses it would suffer in consequence, the further losses it would suffer in consequence, it would now be an extremely severe blow. Of course, if Bakhmut falls and other places fall, and there's been reports over the last few days of continued Russian progress in the Avdiivka battlefield, arguably even more symbolic for the Russians than Bakhmut itself. In Marinka, which, as I said, is connected with the fighting in Vuhledar, there doesn't seem to be much left of Marinka for the Russians to capture. The Russians also capture or recapture Kupiansk, or at least that part of Kupiansk, west of the Oskol River. Then, to be frank, Ukraine's position will look bleak indeed, and all would then depend on whether this counteroffensive that's been so much talked about in Zaporozhye region can retrieve the situation in some way. But of course, in light of those other losses, it might be difficult for Ukraine to mount that offensive. Anyway, we shall see. Now, on the topic of Bakhmut, a very important piece of discussion has taken place, and it's taken place on Slavyangrad, which, to repeat again, is, in my opinion, one of the most reliable sources of information about what's going on the battlefields. As I said, it's Russian, pro-Russian oriented. It supports Russia in this war, but it's often very, very critical of Russian military performance and of Russian military decisions. It is certainly not, as some people would suggest, a site controlled by the Kremlin or the Russian Defense Ministry or anything like that. And Slavyangrad was the site that reached out to me a couple of days ago and told me that the claims that have been circulating about high ground west of Bakhmut, which is the area which, if the Russians control it, it would enable them to look down on Kramatorsk and shell Kramatorsk. They tell me that all of those claims, which have appeared on some Russian sites as well, that then exaggerated to an extreme, and that we're talking about actually fairly flat ground with some undulations. And I can now confirm that it was Slavyangrad because they've now provided a whole series of commentaries actually discussing the ground west of Bakhmut, and they've actually done that which I am not capable of doing, which is they've studied the maps, the contour maps. They've been able to look at the height of the hills, if you can call them hills, west of Bakhmut. And they've been able to come up with what looks to me like a clear explanation, which is that there's no significant high ground west of Bakhmut. This has been a myth. Bakhmut is important, not because it looks down upon, or the area to the immediate west of it looks down upon other Ukrainian towns and fortifications. Not even properly speaking true that if the Russians were to to move west of Bakhmut to where these supposed hills were supposed to be, it's not even true that their medium-range artillery would have Kramatorsk within range. Kramatorsk would be located, I believe, 33 kilometers away. Long-range Russian guns, perhaps the 203 millimeter guns, could probably strike at Kramatorsk, perhaps also some of the more advanced 152 millimeter guns that the Russians have, the Star self-propelled guns. They could probably reach Kramatorsk, but these would be long-range guns. You would not be talking about heavy volumes of artillery being brought to bear on Kramatorsk in the way that some people have suggested. And that begs the question of the origins of this story about the high ground, because where did it come from? Well, I'm going to suggest it comes ultimately from the British media. Various British journalists who have been talking about Bakhmut have said that it is of only symbolic importance, that it is not strategically significant, that if the Russians were to capture Bakhmut, there would be positions to the west of Bakhmut which are actually easier to defend than Bakhmut itself. And I started to read, eventually, pieces about how the Ukrainians would still control the high ground west of Bakhmut, which would amount to a difficult barrier for the Russians to cross. And this story then began to gain wings, because I remember a Ukrainian soldier telling a British journalist, that was a report in a British newspaper. Of course, I wasn't there when this conversation between this Ukrainian soldier and this British journalist supposedly took place. But anyway, there was, I remember this report, a Ukrainian soldier saying that Bakhmut was important because if Bakhmut were captured and the Russians were able to capture the high ground west of Bakhmut, they would be able to bring Kramatorsk and indeed even Slavyansk within range of their artillery, and they would control the high ground over those two important towns. And then, of course, that story began to feed its way into parts of the Russian media as well. This is an instructive case in how stories about this war can gain an extraordinary life, and they shouldn't necessarily be assumed to be true. I've assumed that this was all true. I've assumed that there was this high ground. I stand corrected. It doesn't really exist. Bakhmut is important because it is the biggest urban area standing in the way of the Russian advance towards Kramatorsk. It's also, as discussed many times, a very important communications hub. Capture of Bakhmut will simplify Russian communications in the Donbass area. It will mean that they can move more troops and supplies into the central and northern Donbass area, making it easier for them to push west towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. But by contrast, it will make it more complicated for the Ukrainians to do the same thing. Though, to be frank, given that Bakhmut has been the site of a major battle for weeks now, I can't imagine that the Ukrainians have been able to move their supplies through Bakhmut to any great extent for quite a long time now. But anyway, it's important for those reasons. It is not important because it controls the high ground. So I think I need to say that because, as I said, I've said different things before. You can see how sometimes someone who reports things, even in good faith, gets them wrong because, as I said, all kinds of myths develop, and the story of the high ground was one. Now, talking about myths and other things, we've had information, very interesting information, but often not entirely easy to work out from Putin about the state of the armaments race between the West and Russia over the fighting in Ukraine. And it's been provided over the course of an interview that Putin gave to Russia 24. Now, I have problems because I don't have a complete, reliable English transcript of this interview. The Kremlin doesn't seem to be intending to provide a transcript of this interview, which is interesting. And the media in the West has focused on a part of this interview, which I don't personally consider especially important. Putin over the course of this interview, appears to have said that Russia has agreed with Belarus that they will be setting up facilities within Belarus where the Russians can park nuclear weapons. I didn't get the impression from the excerpts of the interview that I have seen that Putin was necessarily saying that the Russians immediately plan to locate nuclear weapons in Belarus. It seemed to me that what he was saying was that they're providing themselves with a facility that would enable them to transfer nuclear weapons to Belarus at short notice if they had to. Anyway, this story has been widely publicized in the Western media. It's again, the impression that's been given is that this is a sort of dramatic new announcement by Putin, that it represents some kind of extraordinary escalation. I don't honestly see why. After all, the United States has nuclear weapons in Germany, certainly in Britain, most probably in Turkey as well, though there's some reports that those nuclear weapons have been removed, in all kinds of other places around the world. Why the Russians would be breaking any sort of understanding or rule if they were to locate nuclear weapons in Belarus, I'm not able to see. And for what it's worth, I don't think that was what Putin even announced. The Russian media, for its part, has given an entirely different focus to the interview. It's discussed the relationship between China and Russia, and it's focused on Putin's denial that the Russians and the Chinese have concluded an anti-Western military alliance. Now, TASS reported as this: Russia and China are developing military cooperation, including on the military track, but this is not a military alliance. This is absolutely untrue, the president said, when asked whether cooperation between Moscow and Beijing posed a threat to the West. We are not creating any military alliance with China. Yes, we also cooperate on the track of military technical cooperation, but we do not hide it. It is transparent. There is no secret there. And by the way, not only with China, but with other countries as well. We even continue it now, despite the developments in Donbass, Zaporozhye and Kherson. We will still continue. It's all transparent, but it's not a military alliance. Now, again, I think this is Putin adhering to what remains the official line, both in Beijing and in Moscow, that this grand strategic partnership of coordination for a new era, whatever its clunky title is not a military alliance. Now, I'm going to make one observation. I've been waiting for several days now for the Chinese and Russian foreign ministries to publish authorized, validated English language texts of the two joint statements that Putin and Xi signed off in Beijing. And the Chinese and Russian foreign ministries still haven't done so. And interestingly, today, they are publishing English language texts, authorized, validated English language texts of other statements, less important, which post-date the two statements that Putin and Xi signed off on in Moscow. For example, today, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has provided the text of a statement the Chinese government and the government of Honduras have agreed, whereby China and Honduras agree to establish diplomatic relations, with Honduras recognizing China as the legal entity that represents China. Until this decision, Honduras recognized Taiwan in that capacity as one of the few remaining states that continue to pretend that Taiwan was the government of China. Anyway, this is obviously from a Chinese point of view an interesting and important text, but it is hardly carries the weight and significance of the two joint statements that the Chinese and the Russians signed off in Moscow. And this again reinforces my belief that the Chinese and the Russians don't want to draw too much attention to these texts for the moment. Now, to be very clear, Chinese and Russian language versions of these texts undoubtedly do exist, and they have been circulated. They will have been circulated at the United Nations, for example. And certainly Reuters has published its translation of the part of one of these statements, but only confined to Ukraine. So Reuters has texts as other governments do. These are not secret texts. We're not talking about secret texts that are being withheld. But as I said, the Chinese and the Russians are not in a hurry to circulate those texts and make them public to the global audience. All that we have is that TASS report that I quoted from a couple of days ago, which talked about China and Russia pledging to take steps to support each other and to defend each other's core interests, including territorial integrity, sovereignty, and security. And as I said when I discussed that TASS dispatch a few days ago, that isn't actually an outright military alliance. It's only a step back from that. The Chinese and the Russians have not announced an alliance exactly, but they have come very, very close to that point. So Putin's saying, no, we haven't got an alliance with the Chinese. And of course, it's not in any way a threat to the West. Well, one should understand that in that context. And of course, when he says it is not a threat to the West, he is right, strictly speaking. There is no evidence that the Chinese or the Russians have any plans to attack any Western country. Certainly neither the Chinese nor the Russians are thinking of attacking the United States or Western Europe or any of those core states. In fact, what we know about the joint statement is that at some point it actually calls on NATO to remember its declared defensive purpose. In other words, not to meddle around the world in the way that it is doing, and certainly not to extend its reach into East Asia. But, of course, implicit in that is an acceptance of NATO in its original purported restricted form. So the Chinese and the Russians are going out of their way again to say, look, this relationship that we are establishing with each other, it doesn't threaten anybody. It doesn't threaten the West. It certainly doesn't threaten other countries. India, to which I shall come back to, being obviously the key one from a Russian point of view. It's purely defensive. It is a response to Western pressure upon us. Western pressure, specifically American pressure. If the Americans continue to put the kind of pressure on us that they are doing, then of course we will support each other. But this is not the kind of alliance, we're not creating the kind of alliance that the United States and the Western powers have created amongst themselves with entities like NATO, the Five Eyes, AUKUS, and the rest. That is not what we're about. So, that's one thing that the Russians do want us to take away from this interview. And there is another thing that Putin said, and it was quite interesting, in which he discussed economic cooperation between China and Russia. And first of all, he refuted the suggestion that Russia is becoming economically dependent upon China. He made a very interesting point. He said, look, despite everything, we remain a self-sufficient country. We are less dependent on China than the European countries are. It's the European countries that have now come to depend on the China trade to a much greater extent than we have done. But he did say that there is a very important economic aspect to the Chinese-Russian relationship. He said that the Chinese want guarantees of stable supplies of energy, and not, of course, just energy, but also of other goods. You can talk about food, strategic minerals. Russia apparently has enormous untapped lithium deposits, just saying. And the Chinese wanted guarantees that they can rely upon Russia for stable supplies of these things. And Putin said, they've got that, they've got those guarantees. Those guarantees are coming, and that will be the economic core of the relationship. Doesn't mean Russia is just going to be a raw material supplier to China, but it does mean that it will supply China with those commodities, which of course Russia has in abundance, and that will enable the Chinese to circumvent, to nullify, obviously not immediately, but fairly soon, any Western, or to be precise, American blockade that tries to prevent China receiving those sort of goods. So that's what Putin said. Having said that, I don't think any of this is new, and I don't think it's it's not for me the most interesting part of what Putin actually said, because he talked about arms reduction. This is an interesting topic, and it's one I'm going to come to. Now, he said something about tanks, and this has been reported in many different ways. He said that some reports claim that he said that the Russians were going to produce 1,600 new tanks in 2023. Others say that he said that Russia was going to produce 1,600 new and refurbished tanks in 2023. Now, I don't know, I don't have a Russian translation of what he said, but this is a Yahoo translation. The instigators, and of course he means the Western powers. He says they claim that, and this is taken from Interfax basically, in fact, I'm going to go to the Interfax report, which is, as I said, a Russian one. The arsonists, he means the West, plan to send 400 or 450 tanks to Ukraine. Everything is the same as for ammunition. During this time, we will produce new ones and modernize over 1,600 existing ones. The total number of tanks of the Russian army will be 3 times the number of tanks of the armed forces of Ukraine, even more than 3 times. Now, that doesn't look to me like he's saying that Russia's going to produce 1,600 new tanks, and it doesn't seem to me to be saying that Russia's going to produce 1,600 new and refurbished tanks. It seems to me to be saying that Russia is going to refurbish 1,600 existing tanks. Putin is not giving a figure for the number of tanks, new tanks, that Russia is producing. Now, from recollection, I think Medvedev, who was the deputy head of the Russian Military Industrial Commission, said that Russia is going to produce 1,300 tanks, and I got the impression that he was talking about new tanks, in which case that would be 2,900 new and refurbished tanks in total. And that, of course, would be close to the 3 times the number of tanks, or more than 3 times the number of tanks that Ukraine's military has. Ukraine was reported a few weeks ago as having still around 500 T-64s left, and it's going to receive another 420 to 440 tanks from the West, not all of which are modern. In fact, none of them are especially modern, as it turns out. And some of them, the Leopard ones, as I said, date from the 60s. The Russians will be supplying their military in Ukraine this year with a force, new force, which would be 3 times that number. 440 plus 500, 900. Putin is talking about 2,900 new, or seems to be talking about 2,900 new tanks and refurbished tanks for the Russian military. Now, I want to stress these are very speculative figures. As I said, Putin isn't providing exact numbers. And then Interfax and Yahoo quoting was saying something else. This is about aircraft. He said, I'm not talking about aviation. There is a difference of 10 orders of magnitude, perhaps even more than that. Well, that's probably about true. Russia immeasurably outmatches Ukraine in aviation, and we've seen growing signs now that Ukraine's once very powerful land-based, ground-based air defense missile system is now practically exhausted. Then he went on to say something very interesting about shells. In fact, he said quite a lot about shells. Firstly, he said that the British decision to supply depleted uranium shells to Ukraine was intended to cast some kind of a dampener over the Russian-Chinese summit, and that this is how the Russians interpret it. I have to say, I don't agree with him. I don't think that this entered into British calculations at all. I think that the plan to supply the depleted uranium shells with the British Challenger 2 tanks existed all along. I'm going to say something now which I may be completely wrong about. I understand that the 120mm rifled gun that the Challenger 2 tank mounts, has always had less penetrative ability. It's less capable of penetrating tank armor than the 125mm smooth bore gun that Russian tanks like the T-90, the T-80, the T-72 and the T-64 that Ukraine uses mount, and it also has less penetration than the 120mm gun that the Leopard 2 and the M1 Abrams tank mounts. So it's perhaps understandable that the British are therefore supplying this gun with depleted uranium shells, because with shells of that kind, it can match the levels of penetration of others of these guns, of these other guns. Anyway, Putin said that Russia has hundreds of thousands of these depleted uranium shells, which is a rather alarming thought. He said that up to now the Russians haven't used them, but if the British supply them to Ukraine and if Ukraine uses them, then the Russians will counter them. Well, we'll see whether or not that is true. But he then also discussed totals of tank production. He said that according to Russian information, about 14 to 15,000 shells are currently produced in the United States every month. Next year, production will reach the level of 42,000 shells, and in 2025, 75,000 shells. I would say that these are lower production numbers than those that the United States itself is providing. The United States is now claiming that it is producing currently around 20,000 shells a month, and that it expects to be producing around 90,000 shells by 2025. The Russians, presumably based on their own intelligence, apparently believe that these numbers are exaggerated. They believe that the United States is still only producing 14 to 15,000 shells a month, and that by 2025 that number will have risen not to 90,000 but to just 75,000. But then, anyway, Putin then goes on to say, I think that if the United States is going to go from 15,000 shells this year to 42,000 shells next year, then for other countries, and he means European countries, it will be even more difficult. There are still their own rules. Each country has its own plans for the development of armed forces and the so-called national economy, etc. And then he goes on to say that, and then he added that the armed forces of Ukraine use up to 5,000 shells daily. Well, that's a figure from a short time ago. I've heard that actually it's now lower, that it's fallen to 3,000 rounds a day. But anyway, the Russians apparently calculate that, are still working on the calculations that Ukraine uses 5,000 shells a day. And the point Putin, of course, is making, that even with these increased production numbers from the United States, he's more skeptical about what the Europeans can achieve. He says that they can't keep up with Ukraine's use of ammunition. And of course, we've been getting lots of reports about that in the Western media as well. And of course, Brian Paletic has discussed this exhaustively. And then Putin goes on to say this: the Russian armed forces spend much more. I don't want to assess the rationality of decision-making at different levels of military command, but now, as you know, the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff are even forced to introduce certain limits. At the same time, Russian production, the military-industrial complex of Russia, is developing at a very fast pace in a way that many did not expect. Over the same period of time, Russian industry will produce 3 times more ammunition, which we are talking about even more than 3 times more. 3 times more than what? This is, as I said, this is taken from Interfax. My own impression is that he's talking about 3 times more than what he was producing previously. Now, others assume that he means 3 times more than what the West can supply to Ukraine, or 3 times more than what the West is producing. But I think, as I said, based on this quote from Interfax, that what Putin is saying is that Russia intends to treble its production of ammunition. Over what period precisely? Well, that's left incredibly vague. Now, I said that I was not going to discuss my own guesses about Russian artillery production in a program that I did a few days ago when I first looked at this topic. And I'm going to stick with that. But I will pass on some numbers that I have seen quoted. They've been quoted in the Russian media, or so I believe. Actually, I've seen them being quoted in the Russian media. And they were actually quoted at me over the course of a live stream. These same numbers were quoted at me over the course of a live stream that took place on the Duran. And the figure was 380,000 rounds of ammunition a month. Now, it's not clear to me whether that was Russian production rates at the start of the war or during the war. And I'm not even sure that this figure is true. But if Putin, if this figure is accurate, and if the Russians are intending to treble that, well, you can do the sums yourself and can work out what volume of shells we're talking about. Now, I would say that assuming that Russia is producing around 380 to 400,000 shells a month, I reckon that would provide Russian artillery with around 10 to 12,000 shells a day. Russia is supposed, according to the Financial Times, to have entered the war with an ammunition, a shell inventory of around 19 million shells. I would have thought that that in combination would be more than enough to keep up the present usage of shells of 20,000 a day, which the Russians have been using, but of course, if they're going to treble production above that, and that's, again, my own understanding of what Putin is saying, and this is, as I said, drawn from Interfax, then before long, the Russians will be able to exceed these numbers substantially. Now, I want to stress these are all very, very deeply speculative comments about tank production, about shell production, about all of those things. Well, I think one thing is indisputable, and it's what Putin is basically saying, which is that the Russians are able to equip their forces with far more weapons, one way or the other, than the West can supply to Ukraine. The West cannot keep up with Ukraine's current ammunition needs. Russia can keep up with its own ammunition needs, which are higher significantly than Ukraine's. And they can re-equip with many more tanks, new and refurbished tanks, than the West can supply to Ukraine. So in overall terms, the Russians are in a big advantage, have a very big advantage. Well, as I said, it's all a bit speculative. We don't have exact figures. The Russians are never going to give us exact figures. But anyway, that gives us a few clues. Now, I'm now going to discuss fairly briefly a long article published by a person, an Indian diplomat, who was no less in person than the former Foreign Minister of India and Ambassador to Russia, Kanwal Sibal. And I want to stress this is an interview he's giving, and we read it from an Indian magazine, India Narrative, and at the bottom of this article we see that the editors say that Kanwal Sibal is India's former foreign secretary and ambassador to Russia. Views are expressed are personal and exclusive to India Narrative. So there's care being taken to assure us that Kanwal Sibal is not speaking on behalf of the Indian government. And can I, before I discuss this article, express my thanks to the individual who has sent me a private email which has both referenced and provided a link to this article, which was published yesterday. And the article talks about what looks like, to me, a gathering crisis in Indian-US relations. Now, India is the current chair of the G20 summit and of the G20, and there's supposed to be a G20 summit in India in September. And the article, and it must be assumed that a former Indian foreign minister is very well informed about developments on the diplomatic front. It's saying that the United States, Tony Blinken specifically, the Secretary of State, is now making it absolutely clear to the Indian government that the United States will refuse to sign any communique published by the G20 that does not condemn Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. And the wording in the article by Mr. Kanwal Sibal reads as follows: "The West remains determined to include language condemning Russia in all joint statements published by the G20." And Kanwal Sibal says that this means that the G20 is not going to be able to publish any joint statements because Russia obviously will not be party to such any joint statements. And it now looks clear after the Putin-Xi meeting in Moscow that China is not going to be willing to sign off on any such statement either. And the article goes on to read as follows. And since Bali, which is where the last G20 summit meeting happened, the one that was chaired by Indonesia. The situation on the ground has become more and more destructive, rather than the doors of dialogue and diplomacy being slowly opened. The West's strategy remains one of arming and financially aiding Ukraine, not only to sustain its resistance, but also to enable it to launch a counter-offensive. Ukraine's appeals, backed vociferously by Poland and the Baltic states for more lethal arms, including artillery, tanks, and now fighter aircraft, have found increasing support. And as a result, it is not surprising that positions on both sides have become harder. Ukraine's maximalist position, recovery of all annexed territories, including Crimea, reparations by Russia, and war crimes trials of Russians, has public support of Western public policy makers. And as a result, all opportunities for dialogue and diplomacy are being closed off. And the implicit point of this article is that from an Indian point of view, they are being closed off by the West. And the article goes on to say that at previous G20 meetings, these are at lower level, bank chiefs, foreign policy chiefs, India was put in an invidious position because if it excluded any reference to Ukraine in its summary, the West would have construed it as Russia-leaning and not a neutral position. And this position is now being undermined. And it goes on to say that Blinken has warned that at the New Delhi G20 summit, the West will not relent in its demand to condemn Russia. And that's to say Blinken, foresees the G20 summit failing to issue a joint statement because of Russian and Chinese opposition, though that, in his view, will not lead to the collapse of the G20 process, as there will be agreement on a host of other issues. And then Kambal Sibal goes on to say this is being unduly sanguine, as a failure at the summit level will expose the limitations of the G20 format to deal with various pressing issues of development, financial stability, economic growth, climate change, and the like that the international community faces. If one of the objectives of the G20 is reviving multilateralism, the divisions within the G20 between the G7 and Russia and China in particular will in fact deal a further blow to multilateralism. And as a format, the G20 would then have proved ineffective. And then the article goes on to say, if the goal of the West is to isolate Russia, that is not being achieved. Russian diplomacy in Africa and West Asia is active. Russia has just organized a Russia-Africa parliamentary conference. Israel has been cautious, is not aligning fully with the West's position. Russia's role in Central Asia is unaffected. And by the way, incredibly, the EU is apparently now talking about starting to sanction Central Asian states because of their cooperation with Russia. And then the article goes on to say the Shanghai Cooperation Organization processes are proceeding uninterruptedly, with the SCO summit to take place in India later this year. India is maintaining its close ties with Russia, with Foreign Minister Jaishankar, that's the Indian Foreign Minister, stressing recently their steadiness over the years and their current economic expansion. India's ties with Russia are being strategically consolidated further. And then the article goes on to talk about the recent successes of Chinese foreign policy in the Middle East. And then it goes on to say this, that about the question of Chinese arms sales, the West objecting to Chinese arms sales to Russia. It says that these Western objections ignore the fact that Russia itself is a major arms supplier to China, including for S-400 surface-to-air missiles. If the West can supply lethal arms to Ukraine to counter Russia, why is it wrong in principle for China to supply arms to Russia? Why is it that China is being asked to be neutral and prove its neutrality whilst the West can fight a proxy war against Russia? India does not need to hold a brief for China, and stronger Russia-China strategic ties have problematic aspects for India. But can India ignore the manner in which the West is rationalizing and hardening its position on Ukraine, and in the process imposing more disruptive costs on developing countries in particular? Of more concern is that if the situation in Ukraine involves increasingly unfavorably for the West, its pressures on others, including India, are likely to increase in light of the massive political investment it has made in inflicting a major strategic defeat on Russia through Ukraine. And then the article, again written by a former Indian foreign minister, endorses the view that the ICC warrant was intended to embarrass Xi Jinping on the eve of his visit to Moscow. It says to create awkwardness for Xi's visit, the West manipulated the timing of the decision of the International Criminal Court to issue a warrant to arrest Putin for war crimes just before the visit began. And then the article points out that India also does not recognize the jurisdiction of the warrant. If Putin comes to India for both these summits, that's to say for the G20 and SCO summits, will India, which is not a signatory to the ICC, be accused of providing the same cover to Putin? Does this mean that the US is pressing India not to invite Putin to both summits? If the supercharged atmosphere of hostility against Putin in the G7, in the supercharged atmosphere of hostility against Putin in the G7, one can speculate on his presence at the G20 summit, though one can expect him to attend the SCO summit. And then the article basically complains that the West has buried the Chinese attempts to try to find some means to assist peace in Ukraine. And it says this: commentary in India and abroad on strengthened Russia-China ties being at the expense of India should be weighed against the argument that closer India-US ties are necessarily at the expense of Russia. If Russia, by growing closer to China, is supposed to become a vassal of India, has India become a vassal of the US in growing closer to the US? If India can pursue a degree of independence in its foreign policy, despite open pressures from the US to dilute ties with Russia, why should one assume that Russia will not exercise its independent judgment on its relations with India and not yield to any Chinese pressure. If Russia is satisfied with our neutrality on the proxy war between it and the West, why should we not be satisfied if Russia is neutral on issues between India and China? We should take a balanced view, that's to say, India should take a balanced view on such matters, recognizing, of course, the need to navigate very carefully in the choppy waters ahead. Our expectations from a successful G20 summit need to become much more realistic. In other words, the Indians are going to blame the United States for wrecking the G20 summit, and they think that the United States has become absolutely demented on the issue of Russia and Ukraine. And note the point, if the West says that by getting close to China, Russia has become a vassal of China, the logic, that kind of logic would argue that if India becomes close to the United States, it becomes a vassal of the United States, and that is not an acceptable position for India, given its position as one of the leading non-aligned countries and as an evolving great power. And, of course, it is not acceptable to Russia to be construed as a vassal of China either. So, what this article is telling us is that the Indians are coming under pressure from the Americans, that they're not only going to resist, but which they think is wholly inappropriate and at some level demented. Well, there we go. This Western fixation, not just with Ukraine, but with Russia, is souring US relationships. It's already led to a collapse of US relations with Saudi Arabia, to a certain extent with Turkey. It's now threatening US relations with India as well. Whether the Americans, whether the Biden administration understands that or has the ability to understand that is, of course, a different matter. Well, what the US will do, we will see. Whether there's a Ukrainian counterattack over the next few days in the Bakhmut area, we're going to have to wait and see as well. But there it is, an important article from the Indian Foreign Minister, nonetheless, and topics which, of course, we will cover in future programs. Well, that's me for the day, an unusually long video today. More from me soon. Remains to remind you that you can find all our programs on all our various channels, on all our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this long video, press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. It's me for the day, more from me soon.